We'll have your short introduction, and then we have some short discussion. Thank you.
Well, Kalimera, everybody, and thank you to Vasily for the invitation to come to speak to Eni. The title is called A View from London. In the light of events of the last 24 hours, you may think this is a waste of time because London's current position is so ambivalent. But what I'm going to try to do is to talk a bit about European matters, and then, if you allow me the risk of commenting on Greece, to say what I think it might imply for Greece. Let's start with sources of growth, because we neglect the economics of growth too readily. What does growth rely on? Well, one famous New York Times columnist, who also happens to have a Nobel Prize, says it's not exclusively about productivity, but mostly it's productivity. Paul Krugman. Productivity, in turn, needs investment. And what's been missing at European level for many years now is investment. Very low investment rates. Unless you have an increased share of investment in GDP, things are not going to prosper as much as they ought to. And even within investment, what we saw as a trigger for the crisis in many countries was investment going disproportionately to relatively non-productive sectors of the economy, particularly property. Now, all right, I know the ambassador is correct to emphasize what can be done with Hellenikon, but still, property development in the end is not sufficient to keep things going. Then I think what's often missing in the discussion is what I would call forward-looking indicators, those that tell us about what's going to happen in future rather than today. Research and development ratios, critical for manufacturing. ICT investment, critical for service sector development. Patenting. These are the things where Europe is showing very uneven mixtures. Nearly all the patenting in Europe happens in a few regions of Northwest Europe. Very little occurs in the south. And this becomes in itself a source of difficulty. Then, I think it was introduced in the beginning, we heard about skills. Skills matter, and it's not just brain drain and where skills end up, but also the flow of new skills onto the market. The stock of skills is one thing, the flow is another, because we need to accumulate skills and human capital if we want to move to more productive sources of growth. Then I turn to policy solutions. Well, we have hundreds of them at European level. We've had 4 presidents' report, 5 presidents' report. The six-pack is not a reference to my flat stomach. It's the reforms that were taking place at European level. The 2-pack, the fiscal compact, and so on. Und so weiter, as they say in German. And as a result of all of this, we still have a very significant debt overhang at European level. Deficit indicators may have improved, but debt indicators have barely improved. And I don't have to tell you what the debt to GDP ratio is in Greece. It's still hanging there over the economy, although it's been alleviated by the terms of the debt relief package, which is not strictly speaking debt relief, it's a debt extension package that occurred last week. There are difficulties also in the absence of EU instruments. There is no significant EU fund for stabilizing the economy. And in spite of all the efforts to do so, including in the package produced by the European Commission last December, known to some as the St. Nicholas package, if you look at what's proposed there, you see instruments calibrated in hundreds of millions of euros against a problem calibrated in tens of billions of euros. In short, what one of my former LSE colleagues refer to as a capability expectations gap. You cannot do at European level what needs to be done with these small instruments. Then consider structural policies. Now, I know that Greece has endured years and years of talking about the need for structural reform. But structural policies, let's face it, also matter. At European level, we have the regional fund, the social funds, what's known as cohesion policy. We have, laterally, the European Fund for Strategic Investment, which is about to be reborn as InvestEU, the huge investment program launched by Jean-Claude Juncker, also known as the Juncker Plan. And then we have indirect growth-related instruments, such as the EU research programme. Now, Greece does relatively well at the research programme, but many of the areas of Central and Eastern Europe do very badly from it. And it's one area where the Brits do well, and surprise, surprise, we want to stay in after Brexit. So these are the ways in policy solutions are going on. Let me turn third to what I loosely call burden sharing. If you look at what the Germans demand on the euro, what they keep telling us is that they do not want to share risk. They believe that risk ought to be controlled before we even contemplate sharing. This is the Schäuble doctrine, which has been a key part of German approach for the best part of the last decade, since even the beginnings of the euro crisis. Sort out your own problems, and once you've sorted out your own problems, then we will just about consider sharing risks. But this approach means that European economic governance finds it very hard to evolve. We had the European summit last week where some very tentative steps were taken towards it. We had the Meseberg declaration between the Germans and the French saying maybe we need some additional instruments. But when it really comes down to hard numbers, you don't see solutions being put forward. And the reason is, there's two words that you've heard so often, moral hazard. And here I have some sympathy with the Germans. Let me ask the room. If you were a German, would you trust the Greeks?
How about the opposite?
Certainly not. So I think there is a dilemma here about engaging trust at European level that stands in the way of economic governance reform, of putting forward the solutions at European level that are likely to work. And yet there's a German paradox in this. There's an area in which the Germans are pretty well aligned with the Greeks. They want burden sharing on migration. So there's a paradox here. That burden sharing in some areas, but not in others, is the German approach. Now let's consider briefly what's been put forward by the EU on the proposals for the next multi-annual financial framework, the main EU spending instrument, the budget. Two words to describe it: limited ambition. What you see in it is certain new features, the idea of migration management, something more on security and border control, something more, again, a low level of spending of euro instruments, but all moderate. This does not change the game. These are not game-changing proposals that are being put forward. And moreover, even if you look at the aggregate, 60% or more of the EU budget in future will still be the two traditional policies, the common agricultural policy and cohesion policy. Now, overall, if you look at this, it hasn't been negotiated at country level yet, but I think it's going to be quite good for Greece because you will get help with border control, you'll get help with migration management, and you're likely to retain some of the spending that comes through the structural funds. Now, if you'll allow me, therefore, let me try to move on to Greece. And here, an outsider's view, I know the mistakes I'm going to make, you have to live with them. It's a mixed picture. I think that in public investment, what you see is that cohesion policy is roughly 1/3 of public investment in Greece, if you believe the statistics from the European Commission. That's well short of what it achieves in Portugal, where it's 75% of public investment. But in both cases, it's a significant instrument that assists. Gross domestic fixed capital formation in Greece over the last 5 years, this is up to 2017, has been of the order of 12% of GDP, half the rate it was in the previous decade. You are not going to prosper with that level of investment. That's a simple message. And compare this with other recovery countries. In the last 5 years, Portugal has been about 15%, still low. In Poland, not a recovery area, 19+%. Even in Cyprus, in the last 2 or 3 years, you've seen it go from a plummet of down to around 11%, the same level of Greece in 2015, and surging back up to 21% over the last couple of years. This is a major priority for Greece. And yet, if you look at what happens with the European Fund for Strategic Investment, the Juncker Plan, it shows that a high level of investment from that fund has been taking place in Greece. The message I take from that is the same one as Ambassador Payet said earlier: there is latent demand here for investment. There are opportunities for investment that are simply not being exploited up to now, and the various obstacles in the way of investment need to be dealt with. For example, in the European Fund for Strategic Investment, more has been invested in Greece than in Belgium. Same population, about double the GDP. So that's an indicator of where things can improve. There's more even gone into Greece than to Portugal. Patenting data for Greece, admittedly rather old data, show that the Greek patenting rate is very low by European standards. It reaches its highest in Crete, but even in Attica it's quite low. It's below the average even for Central and Eastern Europe, and that's quite alarming. You still have the low export ratio. You know about this. So I would conclude by saying that there are 3 I's that Greece has to try to emphasize. I1, investment. You need more of it. I2, innovation, has to be bolstered, and we've heard various indications of how that will go in the digital economy from earlier speakers. And I3 is integrate by exporting more. Move in those 3 directions and progress will be likely. Now, let me conclude just by quoting, as I always do, the Dalai Lama. Know the rules so you can break them effectively. Thank you.